Fairhaven, Connecticut, was the kind of town where everything seemed perfect. Nestled in the heart of New England, it was a haven for the wealthy, a place where sprawling colonial revival homes stood proudly along tree-lined streets, their pristine white facades framed by vibrant gardens. Here, life unfolded in an unhurried rhythm of charity galas, PTA meetings, and wine nights among neighbors. Yet behind the picturesque scenery lay secrets buried as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks shading the town. At 25, Emily Stone had everything, or so it seemed. She lived in one of Fairhaven's grandest homes, a stately colonial with wraparound porches and a manicured lawn. But within its elegant walls, Emily felt like a ghost. Each day passed in a hollow routine, making breakfast for her husband, Victor, a man nearly twice her age, and watching him disappear into his world of business meetings and high-stakes negotiations. Victor was every bit the image of success, immaculately dressed, silver hair always neatly combed, and a voice that commanded respect. He had built an empire and, along with it, a life of luxury for Emily. But while his hands shaped the world outside, his heart seemed to have no space left for her. Emily longed for connection, for someone who saw her as more than just a piece of his carefully curated life. Instead, she spent her days wandering through their cavernous home, staring at unfinished paintings collecting dust in her studio. It was during one of those long, lonely mornings that Lucas Carter entered her life. Victor had hired him a month earlier as his personal driver, a practical move for a man who spent more time in meetings than at home. Lucas, at 28, was a stark contrast to Victor, tall and lean with an easy smile and a charm that made him instantly likable. He was polite, attentive, and, above all, warm. When he arrived at the house to deliver Victor's car one morning, Emily found herself struck by his genuine interest as he asked about her day. At first, their interactions were brief and polite, confined to stolen minutes in the driveway or casual conversations as Lucas held open the car door. But as Victor's business trips grew longer and Emily's loneliness deepened, those moments became something she looked forward to. Lucas was a good listener, his curiosity genuine as he asked her about the paintings she hadn't touched in years. "You should pick up a brush again," he'd said one day, his tone so encouraging that it lingered in her mind long after he left. Fairhaven's carefully constructed facade began to crack when Emily noticed something different in the way she felt around Lucas, a spark she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just his kindness or the way he seemed to genuinely see her. It was the fact that, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had asked about her dreams. Emily knew she was treading dangerous ground. In a town like Fairhaven, reputations were everything, and Victor's was untouchable. Yet, as she watched Lucas drive away that morning, his smile flashing in her mind like a beacon of light, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than this gilded cage. Beneath the perfect veneer of Fairhaven, something was stirring. For Emily, it was a quiet rebellion. For Lucas, it was a chance to connect. And for Victor, it was the beginning of cracks in a foundation he had spent a lifetime building. Fairhaven basked in the gentle warmth of spring as life in its pristine streets went on uninterrupted. Yet, within the walls of the Stone residence, something new was beginning to bloom. Emily found herself drawn more and more to Lucas Carter, the quiet, unassuming driver who had become an unexpected presence in her otherwise monotonous days. It began with brief encounters, innocuous at first. Lucas would arrive at the house to drop off Victor's car, always pausing to greet Emily. His easy demeanor and genuine interest in her life were a stark contrast to Victor's distant and often distracted manner. For the first time in years, Emily felt seen, not as the picture-perfect wife of a successful man but as herself. The woman she used to be. On a crisp April morning, Lucas arrived earlier than expected to take Victor to a business luncheon. Victor had yet to come downstairs, so Emily found herself unexpectedly alone with Lucas in the driveway. The silence between them felt natural, not forced or awkward. "You've got a real knack for these gardens," Lucas remarked, motioning to the rows of freshly planted tulips swaying in the breeze. Emily glanced at her handiwork and shrugged. "It keeps me busy, I guess," she said, her voice tinged with a melancholy that didn't escape Lucas. "You ever get time to paint anymore?" he asked gently, his hazel eyes meeting hers. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years, not even Victor. For a moment, she hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I suppose I've forgotten how." "You don't forget something like that," Lucas replied, his voice carrying an edge of sincerity that made her stomach flip. "You just stop giving yourself the time." That one line lingered with her long after Victor and Lucas had driven off. The house felt quieter than usual that day, and Emily couldn't help but wander into the studio she hadn't stepped foot in for months. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, settling on half-finished canvases and forgotten brushes. She ran her fingers over the worn bristles of an old paintbrush, Lucas's words echoing in her mind. Over the following weeks, Emily began finding reasons to interact with Lucas more often. A forgotten errand, a midday trip to the garden center, anything to extend their conversations. She told herself it was harmless. Lucas was kind and engaging, and talking to him gave her a much-needed respite from the oppressive silence of her marriage. But deep down, she knew it was becoming something more. It was during one of these errands that their connection took a more personal turn. Emily had asked Lucas to drive her to Fairhaven Preserve, a small park on the edge of town where she often went to clear her head. They stopped at a secluded bench overlooking the tranquil pond. Lucas remained nearby, leaning casually against the car, but his presence felt grounding, almost protective. When Emily invited him to sit with her, Lucas hesitated only briefly before obliging. "You always come out here alone?" he asked after a moment, his tone curious but not intrusive. Emily nodded. "It's quiet. Peaceful. A good place to think." Lucas smiled faintly. "Sometimes, I think people like us spend too much time thinking." "People like us?" she asked, intrigued. "Yeah," he said, leaning forward slightly. "People who feel stuck. Like we're waiting for something to change but don't know what." His word struck a chord. Emily found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. She spoke about her love for painting, how it used to make her feel alive, and how she'd given it up to fit into Victor's carefully constructed world. Lucas, in turn, shared fragments of his own life, a childhood shaped by loss, dreams of becoming a photographer that never quite materialized, and a quiet yearning for something more than driving luxury cars for wealthy clients. The air between them felt charged, though neither acknowledged it aloud. When they returned to the car, Lucas hesitated before opening the door for her. "You should paint again," he said softly, his eyes lingering on hers. "The world deserves to see what you can create." Their relationship deepened with each passing week. What began as light-hearted banter evolved into conversations filled with shared dreams and vulnerabilities. Lucas became Emily's confidant, the person she could turn to when the weight of her life felt too heavy to bear. And in turn, Emily became a source of light for Lucas, a reminder that even in the confines of his modest life, he could still find meaning. One particularly sunny afternoon, as Lucas drove Emily back from an errand, she impulsively asked him to stop at a small art supply store she hadn't visited in years. Lucas parked the car without question, and as Emily browsed the aisles of brushes and paints, she felt a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Lucas didn't rush her or make her feel out of place. Instead, he encouraged her, picking up a set of oils and remarking, "These look like they're just waiting for a masterpiece." Emily smiled despite herself. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to pick up a brush again, to create something just for herself. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the risks. Emily began to notice Victor's glances lingering on her longer than usual, his questions about her day more pointed. She brushed off her husband's inquiries with practiced smiles and vague answers, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he became suspicious. The more time Emily spent with Lucas, the more she felt the pull of something forbidden. It wasn't just his kindness or the way he made her feel understood, it was the thrill of being truly seen for the first time in years. Yet beneath the surface, an unspoken tension loomed. Fairhaven was not a town where secrets stayed hidden for long, and Emily knew that crossing certain lines could shatter the fragile world she and Victor had built. As the days stretched into May, Emily stood on the edge of a decision she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Would she allow herself to step fully into the connection she felt with Lucas? Or would she retreat into the safety of her gilded cage, burying her dreams and desires once more? Little did she know, the choice would soon be taken out of her hands. By the time May rolled around, the vibrant colors of spring had reached their peak in Fairhaven. The town was alive with blooming flowers and sunlit afternoons, but for Emily Stone, the world beyond her home was a blur. Her focus, her thoughts, her very heartbeat seemed tethered to Lucas Carter. Their connection, once an innocent spark, had grown into a roaring fire, consuming her in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Emily's encounters with Lucas became increasingly intimate, both in timing and location. At first, their conversations were confined to quick exchanges in the driveway or quiet chats during errands. But as their bond deepened, so did their desire for moments away from prying eyes. Emily began suggesting longer drives, out to the countryside beyond Fairhaven, where they could talk without fear of interruption. One day, they ventured further than usual, the winding roads leading them to Willow Creek, a secluded spot known for its picturesque views of rolling hills and meadows. They parked the car near a clearing, stepping out to admire the landscape painted in soft hues of green and gold. "It's beautiful," Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas, standing beside her, turned his gaze from the horizon to her. "It is," he said, though his eyes never left her face. The moment hung between them like the stillness of the afternoon, until Emily, unable to resist any longer, leaned in. Their kiss was tentative at first, an exploration of boundaries neither had dared to cross before. But the tentative quickly gave way to passion, the weight of their forbidden desires spilling over in a single, uncontainable moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and wide-eyed, Emily felt her heart racing, not with fear, but with exhilaration. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Back in Fairhaven, Victor Stone was beginning to notice subtle changes in his wife. For years, Emily had moved through their home like a shadow, quiet and compliant, her presence more of a formality than a reality. But lately, she had been different. There was a lightness in her step, an almost imperceptible brightness in her eyes. She laughed more, though never with him, and her once predictable routine now seemed to include errands that took longer than they should. At first, Victor dismissed these changes as trivial, perhaps she was simply finding ways to occupy her time. But the nagging sense that something was amiss refused to leave him. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the long mahogany dining table, Victor decided to probe. "You've been busy lately," he remarked casually, his tone betraying none of the suspicion lurking beneath the surface. "What have you been up to?" Emily, caught off guard, paused mid-bite. "Oh, just the usual," she said with a practiced smile. "Gardening, running errands. Nothing exciting." Victor nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You seem happier these days." The comment made her stiffen, though she quickly masked it with another smile. "Maybe I'm just enjoying the spring." Victor didn't press further, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as Emily busied herself cleaning the kitchen, he found himself in her studio, a place he rarely ventured. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and dust, the canvases stacked against the walls bearing the faint marks of her once active creativity. He couldn't remember the last time Emily had painted, yet here were signs of recent use, a brush left out, a palette smeared with fresh streaks of color. Victor frowned, his mind racing. Emily hadn't mentioned resuming her painting. What else might she be hiding? The next day, Victor's suspicions deepened when he overheard something he wasn't meant to. As he passed the kitchen on his way to his home office, he caught the sound of Emily's laughter, light and melodic, a sound he hadn't heard from her in years. Peeking around the corner, he saw her standing by the window, her phone pressed to her ear. "Lucas, stop," she said, her voice tinged with playful exasperation. "You're terrible at keeping secrets." Victor froze. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as the name registered. Lucas. He recognized the name, of course, his driver, the man he had hired without a second thought. But why was Emily laughing like that? And why was she speaking to him so familiarly? That evening, as Emily slept beside him, Victor lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a whirl of questions and half-formed conclusions. By the time dawn broke, he had made up his mind, he would find out the truth. Victor began his investigation with subtlety. He started by observing Emily more closely, her comings and goings, her excuses for extended errands, and the way she seemed more guarded whenever her phone buzzed. He took to checking her phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through her messages and call logs. While most of what he found seemed innocuous, there were enough gaps and inconsistencies to fuel his unease. Next, he turned his attention to Lucas. In the past, Victor had barely given the young man a second thought, he was just another employee, hired to perform a service. But now, Victor watched him with a sharper eye. Was there something too casual about the way Lucas greeted Emily? Did his smile linger a second too long? Victor's paranoia grew. He began keeping track of the car's mileage, noting the times when Lucas returned later than expected. He even called his assistant to confirm the exact length of his meetings, cross-referencing them with Lucas's schedule. The patterns he uncovered were damning. Errands that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. Trips to the store turned into long detours. By the end of May, Victor was certain of one thing: Emily and Lucas were hiding something. The cracks in his perfect facade were widening, and with each passing day, his anger simmered closer to the surface. But Victor wasn't the type to confront without proof. He was a man who played the long game, and he intended to uncover the full extent of their betrayal before making his move. For Emily, the days passed in a haze of stolen moments and mounting guilt. She knew Victor was watching her more closely now, his questions more frequent, his glances more scrutinizing. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to end things with Lucas. He was her escape, her anchor, her reminder that life could be more than the empty shell she had been living in. Neither Emily nor Lucas knew just how close Victor was to discovering their secret. And Victor, blinded by his growing rage, didn't yet realize how far he was willing to go to reclaim control over his life. Fairhaven, with its idyllic streets and picture-perfect charm, was about to become the stage for a betrayal that would shake its very foundation. The first week of June arrived in Fairhaven, bringing with it the kind of sweltering heat that made the air feel heavy with anticipation. But inside the Stone household, it wasn't the weather that suffocated, it was the unspoken tension. Victor Stone had spent the past weeks quietly piecing together the fragments of his suspicions, and now, he believed he had enough to act. The betrayal simmering beneath the surface of his perfect life demanded retribution. Victor had always prided himself on control, his ability to outthink and outmaneuver in both business and life. He had built his empire on strategy, and now, that same cold precision guided his steps. While Emily had grown more cautious under his scrutiny, she underestimated the depths of his resolve. He noticed the way she lingered by the window when Lucas arrived, the faint blush that crept into her cheeks when their eyes met. On the surface, Victor maintained his usual calm demeanor. He greeted Lucas with the same curt nods and measured tones. But behind those gray eyes, Victor was studying every move the young man made. Lucas, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued to play his role with sincerity, unaware that every interaction with Emily was feeding Victor's growing wrath. The confrontation happened unexpectedly. It was late one afternoon when Victor returned home earlier than planned. As he pulled into the driveway, his sharp eyes caught sight of Lucas leaning casually against his car, talking to Emily. She stood closer than she should have, her body angled toward him in a way that made Victor's blood boil. Victor stepped out of his car with deliberate slowness, his shoes crunching against the gravel. The sound startled Emily, and she quickly stepped back, guilt flashing across her face. Lucas, sensing the tension, straightened and adjusted his posture, trying to appear professional. "Lucas," Victor called, his voice steady but laced with menace. "A word." Lucas glanced at Emily, who gave him a pleading look, before nodding and following Victor to the far side of the driveway, out of her earshot. Victor's expression was cold as steel. "You think I don't see what's going on?" he began, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I'm blind?" Lucas hesitated, his instincts warning him that this was no ordinary conversation. "I don't know what you mean, sir," he replied carefully. Victor's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "Don't play dumb with me. I've seen the way you look at her. Heard the way she laughs when you're around. You think you can walk into my home, into my life, and take what's mine?" Lucas's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Stone, I care about Emily. She's not some possession." Victor's smile vanished, replaced by a glint of fury. "Care about her?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You have no idea what you've done. You've crossed a line, boy. And I promise you, you'll regret it." For a moment, Lucas considered walking away, but his own anger flared. "If you're so worried about her, maybe you should take a look at yourself. Emily's not happy, and you know it." The words hit Victor like a slap, but instead of responding, he took a deep breath, forcing his emotions back behind a carefully constructed mask. "You'll stay away from her," he said finally, his voice cold and clipped. "Or I'll make sure you wish you had." That night, Victor sat alone in his study, his mind racing. Confronting Lucas had only fueled his anger. He had expected the young man to cower, to back down, but instead, Lucas had dared to stand up to him. Worse, he had admitted to caring about Emily. The thought of his wife finding solace in someone else was unbearable. Victor poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim light as he swirled it absently. He couldn't let this continue, not just for his pride, but for the carefully cultivated life he had built. The Stones were the picture of success in Fairhaven, and he couldn't afford for that image to be tarnished. But how to deal with Lucas in a way that ensured there would be no repercussions? His mind turned over every possibility, weighing the risks and rewards. Confrontation alone wasn't enough. No, he needed something decisive. Something permanent. The next day, Victor began laying the groundwork for his plan. He waited until Emily was out running errands to call Lucas. His tone was calm, even friendly, a sharp contrast to their earlier exchange. "Lucas," he said, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I might have overreacted. Why don't we meet to clear the air?" Lucas hesitated on the other end of the line, suspicious of Victor's sudden change in tone. But Victor was persuasive, his words carefully chosen to disarm. He suggested they meet at an old warehouse near the edge of Fairhaven, a secluded spot he claimed was perfect for a private discussion. Lucas reluctantly agreed, driven by a desire to resolve the tension and perhaps even protect Emily from further conflict. Meanwhile, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Victor had been unusually quiet since the driveway incident, and while he hadn't said anything outright, his eyes followed her in a way that made her skin crawl. She tried calling Lucas that evening, but he didn't answer. Her unease deepened when she noticed Victor checking his watch more frequently, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Are you going somewhere tonight?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Victor looked up from his drink, his expression unreadable. "Just tying up some loose ends," he replied, before retreating to his study. Emily's instincts screamed at her, but she couldn't pinpoint why. All she knew was that Victor was planning something, and whatever it was, it couldn't be good. At dusk, Victor drove to the warehouse, his plan fully formed. He parked his car out of sight and waited, the tire iron he had stowed earlier resting beside him on the passenger seat. His mind was clear, his resolve unshakable. Lucas was a threat to his marriage, his reputation, and his control, and Victor had never been one to tolerate threats. When Lucas arrived, stepping out of his car with cautious curiosity, Victor emerged from the shadows, his demeanor calm but predatory. "Let's talk," Victor said, gesturing toward the warehouse. Lucas hesitated but followed, unaware that he was walking straight into Victor's trap. As the warehouse door creaked shut behind them, Victor knew there was no turning back. The confrontation he had engineered would mark the beginning of the end, for Lucas, for Emily, and for the life he had worked so hard to maintain. The evening air was unnervingly still as Lucas Carter pulled his car into the deserted lot of the old warehouse on the outskirts of Fairhaven. Shadows danced under the dim, flickering light of a single street lamp, casting eerie shapes against the rusted metal walls of the abandoned building. Lucas stepped out of his car cautiously, his gut twisting with unease. He had agreed to meet Victor Stone, hoping to de-escalate the situation, but something about this felt wrong. Victor's sleek black sedan was already parked discreetly around the corner, hidden from plain view. Inside, Victor sat gripping the cool metal of the tire iron he had stowed earlier. His pulse was steady, his breathing controlled. Years of business negotiations had taught him to mask his emotions, and tonight, he intended to keep them buried deep. He couldn't afford hesitation. This was about survival, about protecting the life he had built and eliminating the threat that Lucas posed to it. Lucas stepped toward the warehouse, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The air smelled of rust and decay, the remnants of machinery long abandoned. As he pushed open the heavy door, its metallic groan echoed ominously in the cavernous space. Inside, the faint light from his phone illuminated the stark emptiness, a fitting stage for the confrontation about to unfold. Victor appeared from the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the faint light of the warehouse's cracked windows. "You came," he said flatly, his voice devoid of warmth. Lucas tensed, his instincts screaming at him to leave. "You said you wanted to talk," he replied, keeping his tone calm but firm. "So, talk." Victor took a slow step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. "You've made a mistake, Lucas. A grave one. And now, you're going to pay for it." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I haven't done anything wrong, Victor. I care about Emily. She deserves better than." "Better than what?" Victor interrupted, his voice rising, sharp with venom. "Better than the life I've given her? The house, the security, the respect of this town? She deserves someone who actually sees her," Lucas shot back, anger flaring in his voice. "Not someone who treats her like a trophy." The words hit Victor like a slap, and for a brief moment, his mask slipped, revealing the simmering rage beneath. "You think you can just walk into my life and take what's mine?" he growled, stepping closer. Lucas stood his ground. "She's not yours to take, Victor. She's her own person." The words pushed Victor over the edge. Without warning, he lunged, swinging the tire iron he had concealed behind his back. Lucas barely had time to react, raising his arm in defense, but the force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, pain exploding in his forearm. He scrambled to regain his footing, but Victor advanced with relentless determination. "You ruined everything," Victor shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. "You thought you could steal from me and walk away?" Lucas managed to duck another swing, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through him. "This isn't about me, Victor," he shouted. "This is about you and your failure to love her the way she needs." But Victor was beyond reasoning. With a primal roar, he brought the tire iron down again, this time connecting with Lucas's temple. The young man collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling like a discarded doll. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Victor's ragged breathing. He stared at Lucas's motionless form, the weight of what he'd done crashing down on him. Blood pooled beneath Lucas's head, a stark contrast against the cold, gray concrete. For a moment, Victor simply stood there, his mind struggling to process the irreversible act he had committed. Victor's survival instincts kicked in almost immediately. He knew what he had to do. Panic wouldn't serve him now, only calculation. He quickly surveyed the scene, taking mental notes of every detail. He couldn't afford any loose ends. Reaching into Lucas's jacket pocket, Victor pulled out the young man's phone. He scanned the recent messages and calls, deleting any evidence that might link him to Emily. Then, he arranged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He scattered Lucas's belongings around the warehouse, tossing his wallet and keys a few feet away. The tire iron, now stained with blood, was wiped clean of his prints and placed near Lucas's hand to suggest a struggle. Victor stepped back, his hands trembling slightly despite his efforts to remain composed. It was a crude setup, but it would have to do. Satisfied with his work, he exited the warehouse, ensuring no trace of his presence remained. As he drove away, his mind raced with rehearsed alibis and fabricated timelines. He needed to act as though nothing had changed. Back at the Stone residence, Emily paced the living room, her unease growing with every passing minute. Lucas hadn't responded to her calls or texts all evening, and Victor had disappeared without explanation. Something was wrong, she could feel it in her bones. Unable to bear the mounting anxiety, she grabbed her coat and keys, determined to find Lucas. She drove aimlessly at first, unsure where to look, but a nagging feeling drew her toward the outskirts of town. When she saw his car parked outside the warehouse, her stomach sank. Inside, the sight that greeted her would haunt her forever. The dim light of her phone revealed Lucas's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, her breath caught in her throat. "No. No, no, no," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. She shook him gently, her hands trembling, as though willing him to wake up. But the cold stillness of his body confirmed the worst. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched at his shirt, her heart breaking into a million pieces. "Lucas," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Amid her grief, another realization struck her, a chilling, undeniable truth. Victor. It had to be him. The man she had once trusted had taken everything from her in a single, brutal act. And now, she was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life she could no longer recognize. Victor returned to the house hours later, his demeanor calm and collected. Emily was nowhere to be found, but he didn't panic. He poured himself a drink, letting the familiar burn of whiskey steady his nerves. He had done what needed to be done, what any man in his position would do. And now, all he had to do was wait. But Victor underestimated Emily. The woman who had once been passive and compliant was no longer the same. Fueled by grief, anger, and a desire for justice, she would not let Lucas's death be in vain. As the clock struck midnight, the storm clouds of retribution began to gather. For Victor, the illusion of control he had clung to so tightly was about to unravel in ways he could never have foreseen. The days following Lucas Carter's murder were a blur for Emily Stone. Grief, anger, and fear swirled in her mind as she grappled with the reality of what had happened. The memory of Lucas's lifeless body, the cold concrete beneath him stained with blood, haunted her every waking moment. Yet, amid the storm of emotions, one thought burned brighter than the rest: Victor had to pay for what he had done. Victor returned home that night with an air of calculated calm, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Emily, however, was waiting. She sat in the dimly lit living room, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When Victor stepped through the door, his eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You were with him, weren't you?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of accusation. Victor set his briefcase down with deliberate slowness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly, but his jaw tightened. Emily rose to her feet, her body trembling with barely contained fury. "Don't lie to me, Victor. I went to the warehouse. I saw him. I saw what you did." Victor's mask of composure slipped, replaced by a flash of irritation. "You don't know what you saw," he replied coldly. "Lucas was a threat to our marriage, to everything we've built. I did what I had to do to protect us." "Protect us?" Emily's voice cracked with emotion. "You didn't do this for us. You did this for your pride, your control. You took him from me, Victor." Victor stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing tone. "He was poisoning you, Emily. Filling your head with lies. You should be thanking me." But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. Grief and anger had transformed into resolve. "I'm going to the police," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I won't let you get away with this." Victor's expression hardened, but he didn't stop her. He underestimated her strength, just as he always had. The next morning, Emily walked into the Fairhaven Police Department and demanded to speak with Detective Rodriguez, the lead investigator on Lucas's case. Her hands shook as she recounted everything she knew, from Victor's confrontation with Lucas to the mounting tension in their marriage. She handed over Lucas's phone, which she had taken from the scene, containing incriminating messages between her and Lucas that Victor hadn't deleted. Rodriguez listened intently, his expression grim. "This is a strong start," he said. "But we'll need more evidence." Over the next week, the police dug deeper into Victor's life. They uncovered security footage from a neighboring property that captured Victor's car arriving at the warehouse the night of the murder. Witnesses came forward, recalling heated exchanges between Victor and Lucas in the weeks prior. Piece by piece, Victor's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The trial was a spectacle that gripped Fairhaven. The once respected Victor Stone, now accused of murder, sat stoically in the defendant's chair as the prosecution laid out a damning case. Emily testified with unwavering determination, recounting the emotional abuse and manipulation she had endured, as well as the events leading up to Lucas's death. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them neighbors who had once admired the Stones as the pinnacle of success. Whispers of shock and betrayal rippled through the crowd as the truth came to light. Victor's attempts to paint Lucas as a dangerous intruder fell apart under the weight of the evidence, and by the end of the trial, the verdict was clear: guilty. As the judge handed down Victor's sentence, Emily felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it came at a devastating cost. In the aftermath, Emily sold the house in Fairhaven and moved to a small apartment in New Haven, far from the memories that haunted her. She began painting again, channeling her grief into her work. Her first piece, a portrait of Lucas, his kind eyes and gentle smile immortalized in vibrant oils, became the centerpiece of a gallery show that drew critical acclaim. Through her art, Emily found a sense of purpose she had thought lost forever. She dedicated the show to Lucas, her voice trembling as she spoke to the audience. "This is for those who remind us to live, even when life feels impossible," she said. "For those who see us when we've forgotten how to see ourselves." As she stepped back from the podium, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She still carried the scars of her past, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were a reminder of her strength, of the life she had reclaimed. The story of Emily, Lucas, and Victor is one of betrayal, loss, and ultimately, resilience. It's a reminder that the pursuit of control and pride can destroy everything, while courage and honesty can pave the way to freedom. What do you think about this story? Did Victor deserve his punishment? What would you have done in Emily's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that delve into the complexities of human relationships and the choices that define us.